What we have here this evening is some fabulous people who are involved, have been involved in the history of People's Park, and it's going to be a panel discussion. Each of our panelists, we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have Dan Siegel, Carol Denney, Jim Chanin, Joe Leisner, Andrew Pritchett. We'll each have a 10-minute presentation, and then following that, you can ask all the questions you want. Conversation can fly, discussions can happen. I'd like to start the evening off while everybody's still getting settled with Hallie Hammer is going to start us off with a song to get us right in the mood.
I'm sitting up here because they put me up there, but I don't have a presentation. My presentation is the song. This is a song that I wrote. We were having hearings about the park. You know, this was an ongoing thing. It wasn't just like we were threatened once and things changed. It's like we're constantly under threat from UC Berkeley. It's something that, and this was my testimony at one of the hearings that we had. This is when David Nadell was alive. It started back in '69. The time had come to cross that line. And Reagan's troops gas killed and maimed, but still the people refused to be tamed. They did struggle, blood, sweat, and toil. Up came the concrete, back to living soil. People's Park, more than a grassy spot, it became a symbol for what could not be bought. For several years, it was left alone, and there the homeless finally found a home. There was food when there was no way, speeches and music from a concert stage. We put in swing and we planted trees, laid down the plumbing and the flower seed. But late at night, the university still came to destroy what they refused to build. And now you see, threatens once again, showing us a ruse disguised as a plan. Do they think they can lay down rules? Do they think we're so easily fooled? Can't they see that the spirit remains, one they can't stop with their fiscal gains? We'll work and fight if the need arises to keep the park green before our eyes. So tell me, where will it go from here? Can they own this land? Can they own the air? And I swear no building will be seen where the land must stay. forever green, where the land must stay forever green, where the land must stay forever green.
Thank you, Howard.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we're winging it a little bit this evening. We had not really discussed who among our panelists was going to go first. Because, well, so,
Rock, paper, scissors.
rock, paper, scissors. Does anyone have a preference as to?
I think they should wrestle for it.
Ooh.
I have a preference. Well, I'd love to hear chronologically.
All right.
Maybe you should go first.
Yeah. I'll start in 1964. How's that?
That's
So, my name is Dan Siegel. I was around here from 1967 through 70 and kind of stuck in the area. But I think that the People's Park is subject to kind of consistent revisionist history because it's portrayed as just a fight about green space in a park and planting vegetables and throwing the frisbee around. And I don't really see it that way. To me, People's Park begins with the free speech movement in 1964 and the struggle for people in this community, students and non-students alike, to make decisions about how this area is going to be governed and utilized. For those of you who were not part of the free speech movement, I wasn't, but it got kicked off because Berkeley students and other people in Berkeley went to the South to work on the civil rights movement, to register voters, to deal with the Klan, and to deal with the issues there. And they came back to Cal that fall and thought to themselves, well, we'd like to organize for civil rights on campus. So they set up tables in Sproul Plaza to recruit people to take part in civil rights activities, and the university promptly told them they could not do that. Right? So the free speech movement began, and as those of you who have followed that history, thousands and thousands of students became involved. There were building takeovers, there were fights with the police, and ultimately the university conceded. They conceded to tables on Sproul Plaza, where there are still tables, and they conceded to the idea that there would be student-run rallies every day on the Sproul Hall steps from about 12:10 to 1 o'clock. And that's what the free speech movement ultimately accomplished. And just as a side point, I'm sure that Mario Savio would literally spin in his grave if he happened to wake up and be transported to the Free Speech Cafe. Because he and the rest of us who are active in the movement could not handle the idea that everything had become officially co-opted and part of the tradition and history of this tremendous institution. So fast forward, and I can speak from 67 on. When I was here, I came in 67 to go to law school because I was excited about the idea of Berkeley. And within a week of arriving here, I heard about Stop the Draft Week, that people were organizing on campus to go to downtown Oakland for a whole week of activities to try to physically stop the induction center, which at that point was located at 1515 Clay Street, right where the current state building is located, from processing people for induction and being sent to Vietnam. And so it was thrilling, literally. Thousands of people showed up the first morning. The way it was organized by the different groups on campus and different factions, if you will, is that the first day was going to be the day for peaceful nonviolence. And so what happened is Joan Baez and David Harris and other people who were part of the nonviolent wing of the peace movement decided they would simply sit in the doorway of the induction center and peacefully protest the draft. Well, that lasted about 5 minutes because a bunch of Oakland cops showed up and proceeded to literally kick the crap out of them. I was standing right there where these cops walked over David Harris, Joe Baez, Ira Sandpearl, and other people who were sitting in the doorway peacefully, hurt them, and began to use their billy clubs on everyone else who was around offering support to this protest. They marched out of the parking garage right there at 14th and Clay, which is still there, but is now closed because it's an earthquake hazard. Several hundred of them in their riot gear and beat the hell out of people, which is kind of surprising but exciting. It's my first week in Berkeley, and I got hit on the head with a billy club and bloodied up, and went back to law school that day, very carefully not washing my head off, and went into a criminal law class and demanded to know why the professor was so focused on Latin bullshit instead of how the criminal law was enforced in downtown Oakland. Didn't make much of an impression on him and continued. But what happened over the next couple of weeks was interesting because people came back to the campus, wanted to have rallies to continue to mobilize people to go to downtown Oakland, and the university promptly ended the rallies. They outlawed the rallies, said, sorry, Sproul Steps would not be available this week to organize for Stop the Draft Week. A group of students said, well, we're resourceful, smart enough to get into Berkeley, and found other sound equipment and set it up on the steps of this building and had rallies. The university then promptly suspended several of the students who were involved in organizing Stop the Draft Week, which kicked off the movement against political suspensions, which we called MAPS. And in those days, it was a lot easier to get into Sproul Hall, and several hundred of us literally took over every office in Sproul Hall. Every floor, every office was taken over by students as part of that movement for political suspensions. By the next spring, so now we're talking about spring '68, there was very active organization on campus and throughout the country against the draft. And there was a lot of effort made to mobilize people against the draft. And there was a campus draft opposition, which in my experience, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, is the last time that students and faculty were united in militant opposition to things that were going on campus. And we decided that we would have a Vietnam commencement and wanted to have it in the Hearst Theater. Well, no surprise, the regents and the university said, no, you're not going to have it in the Hearst Theater, and by the way, you're not going to have it anywhere, and we're not going to allow you to organize people to resist the draft and do anything illegal. We decided to do it anyway, and this really was a great moment for the faculty, because we had it on Sproul Steps. We had approximately 200 professors who made a ring around the steps, not in front of the steps, but the sides and the back of the steps, to ward off the cops if they decided that they were going to try to break this thing up. And we had this Vietnam commencement on the steps of Sproul Plaza. It was a great event. We asked people to take a pledge to refuse induction, and hundreds of people did. And that was another event in which the student body and the campus community really fought back against the university. And that, in my mind, is what sets the stage for People's Park, right? The next fall, the fall of 1968, was the Third World Strike. And again, it was a major fight between the university administration, in this case, a movement led by Third World students, to have more students of color on the campus, more faculty of color on the campus, a more relevant curriculum, which included what ultimately became the Third World College. That was, just in case anybody surprise, the most violent police crackdown on students at this university. And I would submit that was primarily because this movement was led by Black and brown and Asian American students, and the cops felt completely free to beat the hell out of people, not only with billy clubs. I remember walking through Sather Gate one day and running into a San Francisco cop who was there on mutual aid with his gun out, pointing it at people and threatening people. And ultimately, the Third World Strike was successful, and we got into the spring. And the spring was People's Park. And People's Park was a very intentional, conscious effort led by a group of students and a lot of people in the community to claim this space, which had been previously a space where there had been some kind of rundown housing where people lived and a lot of activists lived. The university bought the property, tore down the housing, allowed the land to just degenerate into a dumpy parking lot, literally. It was a mud hole, full of ruts, full of trash. People parked there every which way they wanted. It really was an eyesore, and there were these vague plans that the university talked about in terms of building a soccer field there or whatever. I guess it was a soccer field. So people started,
2 more minutes.
okay, I'll be quick. People started to reclaim the property. It became a park. It really was a beautiful place. There was grass, there was volleyball, there were gardens, vegetables, flowers, and so on. The university couldn't stand it because people were exercising some sort of right to self-determination. Roger Hines, who was the Howard chancellor at the time, was involved in making threats and negotiations. He was supposed to meet with a group of parents of small kids who lived in the area and use the park on May 15th. Instead, he headed to LA, stood them up, and while he was gone, the highway patrol shows up in the middle of the night, fences the park. May 15, we exercised our right to take over the other rally that had been planned that day. During that period of time, there was a rally literally every day on the steps of Sproul Plaza. And of course, whoever had reserved it was happy to cede it to a conversation of People's Park. I'll just tell the story and then I'll quit. So at that point, I had just been elected student body president. And I, of course, went out to the rally at noon, and some people said, there was a student senator named John David Backrack, is he around? He said, Dan, you need to speak, you need to speak. So I said, okay, I will speak. And I spoke kind of ad hoc at around 12:30. The timing is important because when I ended my speech by saying, don't let those pigs beat the shit out of you, go down there and take the park. And I expected that when I'd be done, then other people with more legitimacy than me and with having the benefit of planning would get up and say, okay, here's the plan for the day. Instead, what happened is that they turned off the sound equipment when I was done, and it was quiet. There was no more sound coming out of the loudspeakers. What I remember is there were some people standing behind me. Tom Hayden was one, Michael Lerner was another, and they were saying, Dan, why didn't you end the rally? Why didn't you do that? We were going to talk. And I said, I didn't do anything. They just turned off the sound equipment. The end of the story is slightly funny. I was accused of inciting a riot, and I went to trial in the fall of that year. In a criminal case or any other case, you have discovery. You're allowed to find out what the evidence is that the prosecutors had. So we got the tape from the DA's office, and sure enough, as I finished speaking, the sound equipment went off, but they had a tape of me speaking with these other folks who were angry at me for ending the rally. Turned out that within the big fat microphone for the speaker system, there was a little small microphone that was embedded and was connected by a wire to a tape recorder in the Sproul Hall police station. And that was how we found out about what they were doing. And sorry, I probably spoke too much. I did get off. I was tried, I was acquitted. And,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Perfect kickoff, that was good.
Yeah.
Brilliant, excellent.
All right, so we're going chronologically. Who would like to go next?
Chanin.
I guess it's me.
Yeah.
Okay, so before I start, I want to say that I've known Dan a long time, and this is the very first time I learned that I was about 5 rows behind you on Clay Street that morning. It was the first time I ever saw the Oakland police. And everything he said is true and more. And I, because I was behind him and started running, I got away without getting beaten. That came later, but I'll stop there. I moved to Berkeley in 1964 for about 6 weeks when I was 17 years old. I went to a program called the Encampment for Citizenship. I went back to my hometown, which was a Republican town in New York, and I was the only one against the Vietnam War. And it was a lot of fun being a senior in that high school, but that's another story for another day. But I moved back to California in summer of 1967, and I moved to Berkeley in September of 1967. And I got a bus, the F bus, which didn't go to Bancroft and Telegraph then, it just stopped at Dwight and Shattuck. I took all my possessions, which was in a heavy bag, and I went up to Dwight and Telegraph and went a little further and saw a place for rent on People's Park. Of course, it wasn't People's Park then, it was 2523 Dwight Way. And I lived there for just 2-3 months. I was interviewed by someone a while back, and they said this was the picture of 2523 Dwight Way.
That was your house?
But I don't remember it quite that way, but it was a long time ago. Anyway, so we got an eviction notice from the university. I've been a lawyer now 40 years, but at that time I was 20 years old. I was ignorant about my legal rights. So I went down to protest to University Hall, and I was told that they had done a study and that no students lived in my house. Well, the house was half students, and I said, did that include going there and talking to people? But he wasn't in the mood to answer that question. So I was evicted during finals, and I had to move. And the house was torn down. The place was a mud hole for about a year and 3 quarters, something like that. People parked there. Sometimes when it rained, the cars would slip into the lake there, and they'd get stuck there for months. And then in April of 1969, the people started building a park, which didn't last very long, because the university decided, well, now that something's happening there, we should assert our rights, and they put notices up that they were gonna come in. No trespassing signs is what I recall. So I was at that time living on 10th Street, and I had a job when I was going to Cal as a longshoreman, and I didn't have a union book, I had a union card. And when they called all the members, then they called the people with the cards. So as I was going up University Avenue, I saw this long line of highway patrolmen coming down. It was May 15th. And I waited until the last one went by, and then I made a U-turn. There was going to be no work for me that day, at least not on the docks. So I followed them up to People's Park. I told my friends, you got to remember at this time I had no phone. There were no cell phones. There were no computers. There were no texting, emails, nothing. yet somehow 10,000 people or something like that wound up in Sprout Plaza by noon. And to this day, I think, how did that happen? You know, how did that happen? But it did happen. And I didn't know that the mic was turned off because when Dan finished speaking, I was marching down Telegraph, you know, we were ready to roll. So I got as far as Hayes Street, and this guy with, this cop, with a plastic grenade. They had two kinds of grenades, tear gas grenades. They had the kind in the can, and then this had this plastic kind. So it was thrown, exploded in my face, and I went down. Some medics came up and helped me. And then I just kept going, because basically it wasn't about the park. It was just 10,000 people who've been pushed too far on the war, pushed too far by the university, pushed too far on race, and that was the time and place where it just snapped. For me, at least, that's what happened. And I think there were quite a few other people. So in short order, there was a riot. And then the sheriffs, who were called the Blue Meanies then, because they were dressed in blue, bright blue, they started raising their guns like this. And of course, I didn't know whether it was tear gas or what it was, but it looked scary. I started running down Hayes Street. And to this day, I think I was shot. I wore to a demonstration a black leather jacket that I'd gotten in some store for $1. And it was a San Francisco cops motorcycle jacket that was totally wasted. But it was great for me to go to demonstrations, and I wore a sweater under it, a shirt under it, a t-shirt under it. And so I felt like someone took their hand and just hit my hand back as hard as they could. But there was no blood when I took my top clothes off. There was just a big red mark. But the guy next to me, he got shot in the legs and he went down and he was bleeding. So I got out of there. I didn't get out right away. I was so angry, I didn't care. I figured, well, today's a day, I'm gonna die, you know. And so then on May 19th, I was arrested on College in Ashby. And they had this technique where they would march up to somebody, didn't have to be doing anything, and they just drag you away. Yeah. So I was on the sidewalk watching this thing, watching people demonstrate in the street, and they dragged me away. And I went to jail, and it was Malcolm X's birthday. Frank Borghi was there. And we were all singing happy birthday to Malcolm X. And the police, they didn't care for that. So if you had your hand on the bars, it was an old city jail, not the one now, they'd come by and like try and hit your hand with a billy club. So the next day they dropped the charges on me, and subsequently the charge I was arrested for, 1,600 military and veterans, was declared unconstitutional. So flash forward a number of years, I was part of the demonstration that took the parking lot apart. I don't know what year that was. It was sometime in the 70s. And I was part of a lot of demonstrations too, many that Dan alluded to and more, but I can't go through that now. But then flash forward another 10 years, and Waddell Shira called me up. At that time I moved to Oakland and I'd become an attorney. At that time I was into Indian history, and I got a fellowship, and I had no interest in being a lawyer, but this is the incident that really changed my mind about what I was going to do with my life, because I just felt, you know, I'd seen what happened to the Panthers and seen I was involved in the Third World Strike, and I just decided Indian history is for another lifetime. So Maudel Shira called me and said she wanted me to be on the Use Standards and Evaluation Advisory Committee, which was the group that sort of governed, I don't know, we advised on
Yeah.
People's Park for 5 or 6 years. From
No authority.
No authority, right. And so that was from 91 to 96 or something like that. And there were, I told Maudel, I said, well, Maudel, I live in Oakland now. She says, well, you're a smart attorney, figure it out. So I went to the first meeting and they never asked, so I was on there for 5 years. And I lived in Oakland. And so, you know, everyone knew it, but I don't know whether it was legal or not. But anyway, while we were there, we successfully got the volleyball court out, which was an insult to the people at CIL, especially. I mean, here's a sand volleyball court a block away from one of the biggest places for disabled people in the country, and the nearest park was People's Park, and the only volleyball court was a sand volleyball court. And they said, well, we have to have it there. And I run a lot, so I run behind Smythe, Fernwall, or Clark, or whatever it's called now. And so it was like 5 volleyball courts that were sand that were unused. And I told the, and they were owned by the university. And I told them that, and hopefully that had some influence on them. Who knows what influences them. But then after that, that was the end of my association formally with People's Park in '96. And I still go running there. Sometimes I run over my old house on 2523 Dwight and think about those days. And as for what they I think that what happened, I'll say in closing, that the mayor of Berkeley, Jesse Aragon, so-called progressive, was recently quoted as saying that he was for ripping down People's Park. And he has no memory of, institutional memory of the people, or person died there, another person was blinded there, people, over 100 people were shot there. It deserves to exist in its present form. It deserves to be commemorated for many more years past whatever the university is planning on doing now. They have no right. They have forfeited their right to do anything about People's Park. The one thing they should do is to clean it up. That's mainly a volunteer effort to this day, and the university sort of lets it sit there, hoping that people will be disgusted by it and will join their cause to rip it down. And that's a purposeful act, which they should be called out on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Now, all right. It's suspenseful. Who feels?
Well, I'll go now. We might be contemporaries in the next part.
Well, yeah. So maybe some
Yeah.
blending, some overlapping.
Absolutely.
All right.
That'll work for me.
Carol Denney.
Yeah, I'm Carol Denney, and I came here as a student in '72, and I read about People's Park and the stuff going on up there, but of course I was in high school, and when I got here, the park I still think the park is just beautiful. I couldn't study in the dorms. It was like everybody's playing their music, and it was party time at Davidson Hall, so I studied in People's Park and picked up licks there as a guitarist, and I thought it was a great place. It was, I still look back and think, you know, some of my best buddies turned out to be the junkies, drunks, and bums that everybody complains about. I just really got along with everybody hanging out there and began to get to know people through the concerts. So I met David Nidell very early on. He was one of the people who regularly put great music on the stage. Met Joy of Cooking, met the Grateful Dead, met Robert Hunter, the writer for the Grateful Dead. Met Wavy Gravy and began to play on the People's Park stage. So I was a student, but I also was somebody who participated there, did a lot of gardening there, and I thought the native plant people, now please do pass these out, I know I brought enough for everybody. The native plant people, of course, were really interesting to me because they were insisting on native plants, and I didn't know a thing about that at the time. So I used to make it out in the West End garden. I would just make these little, I'm skipping over when they came and poured concrete all over, or asphalt all over the West End. So I would pass People's Park all the time, and when they came and did that, we were just incensed. We thought, this doesn't make any sense. They're gonna take a third of the park, or close to a third of the park, and make it a parking lot. And then the next day you'd go by, and somebody had broken off the front of the little feedlot bar. And the next day, somebody was digging out the little teeth that come up and wreck your tires. And the next day, there was a whole line of people with pickaxes just tearing up the asphalt, and I thought, this is the right thing to do. So when I joined that, and I think this is crucial, in dramatic contrast to Mayor Jesse Otter, the mayor we have today, Gus Newport, who was mayor at the time, walked the periphery of the park for weeks, counseling any police who showed up that it was fine if they were there. Thank you so much, officer, for being here. He'd shake their hands, have a little chat with them, and then remind them that they should not set 1 foot in People's Park. Because he wanted to avoid the riotous scenes that had come before. Not on his watch was anybody get killed, blinded, or hurt. That was a wise man, a man who's still alive, still organizing, runs off to Vermont to work with Bernie Sanders all the time. Very much someone who I think will help us in our efforts. So anyhow, when they came and decided to put volleyball on the court, now I think that was a use committee decision, I have to say. I joined the resistance to that because it made no sense to me. And I'd never been to jail, but my friends convinced me it was time to go, and they were right. Taught me how to put on a hard hat and put 4 pairs of gloves on because they were gonna put plastic wrist stuff. I got searched 8 times, including a strip search on my way to jail. But Bob Sparks wasn't searched once on his way to jail. We were both part of the initial 36 people who went to jail. So when I got out of jail, of course, there'd been this huge riot that they ended up blaming us for, even though we were stuck in jail and had nothing to do with what it was, in fact, a police riot. We did this whole documentation of it having been a police riot because one cop got badly hurt, a cop named McBride. And then everything went crazy on the street. So we did this whole documentation of it so that we wouldn't be blamed. Nobody cared. So I joined Community Defense Incorporated. I was the office coordinator for them, and the idea was if you were going to go to jail, and we were going to jail over and over and over, there were protests all the time. It was a lot like Jim described. So I wanted to make sure, and the people at CD Inc. was basically an office and a bucket of civil rights attorneys and people who knew how to navigate the criminal courts. The idea was anybody who went to jail would have a lawyer at the ready and would be apprised of their rights through the work done by Cop Watch, making sure everybody knew what to say and what not to say and how to handle it. And out of almost 450 arrests in the first 6 months, we only had 2 convictions. I'm really proud of that. Because what's going on right now down there in the Superior Court is a plea deal machine where everybody gets their whole life messed up behind taking a plea. So I won't go long on that, but glad to talk about it. Also started Free Radio Berkeley with Stephen Dunifer, and that played a huge role. We knew that, except for maybe KPFA now and then, nobody was going to cover this the way we needed to cover it. So we spawned Free Radio Berkeley, 104.1, We had, you know, sometimes we just went up in the hills and worked 3 hours every Sunday night, but I was part of that initial crew. And what was cool was the UC cops couldn't recognize the equipment. If they came up to us and said, "What are you doing?" we would just say, "It's a science experiment." They go, "Okay." Yeah, they'd go away. So we rarely had to do terrain, you know, mostly we could set up right beside the car. And it eventually expanded to 24/7, which it still is in many areas. So we fought for a little bit of our micropower rights. But the other thing we did, I worked with David Nadell to bring up these displays. Every weekend, every Saturday, every Sunday, we put up these big displays of photographs. The idea was to help people connect to the earlier protests, the free speech movement, and see what Dan was talking about. That this wasn't just about this little plot of land. It was much bigger than that. And if you go back to the UC Regents meetings of the 50s, you'll see what I mean. They were terrified of rock and roll. They were scared to death of homosexuality. Poetry readings were terrifying to them because they were riotous, and I mean that. I used to go to them all the time, and they were a blood sport. So they wanted to be Harvard. They wanted to be Yale. They did not want the reputation that Berkeley was accruing of being other than the Republican town it once had been. It was a riotous change in culture, musically, in every way. They did not want the students here to ever hear about Marxism. They were terrified. So that's really a fun read if you want to get there. The other thing I did was a whole lot of gardening, and I really want to appreciate the gardeners along the way. And what I just passed out to you, I'm going to mention briefly. I did not know that the trees that they just tore down out of the East End were part of a project done by the Native Plant Forum. And they were 19 subsections of native plant communities to demonstrate all of California's native plant communities. And each one, this was really a work of art to do in such a small area, you know, almost 1 acre of park. But they did it, and that's what this map is, hand-drawn by David Axelrod, one of the gardeners and one of the early lawyers for People's Park. So I did all kinds of things. I'm also an artist and did a lot of art projects that I won't go into. But the other thing I was hit by a SLAPP-suit, along with David Nadell, along with Bob Sparks, along with Mike Lee, and 50 Jane and John Does. And the reason this happened really was, you know, they arrested so many of us. They beat so many of us. They injured so many of us. They tried to frighten us. We were unstoppable. So then they sued 4 of us. All of a sudden I get a phone call. It was January 9th, 1992. You're expected in Superior Court in Oakland tomorrow. You're being sued by the UC Regents. Show up in department something, you know, right? I was such a fool. I said, "Oh, thank you for letting me know." So then the phone rings again, and it's David Nadell. He goes, "Did you get a really weird phone call?" I said, "Yes, I did." He goes, "Well, you want to riot tomorrow, you know, we got to be there," which was wrong. Over here, Chanin was one of the attorneys who showed up for us and flipped through the papers and said, "You haven't been served, get out of here." So, race down there, get to this place, and then we're told by our attorneys who were just looking at this stuff and thinking, you know, we know there's people that can't have done all this. I was supposed to have beaten up a football player. That'll be the day. So anyhow, the idea of a SLAPP-suit, that's an acronym for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. It's just to scare you, to cost you a lot of money because you don't get a free lawyer in civil court, and then to make a whole bunch of false charges that you're never going to be able to confront in court ever. Poor David Nadell, he wanted to clear his name so bad. He was charged with all this stuff. You know, we were charged with a combination of stuff that was true, like you wrote a letter in defense of People's Park. And we thought, well, yeah, we did that. You spoke at a hearing, you know. And then they'd throw in a lot of stuff that was violence. And David Nadell and I were hardcore nonviolent people. We were so offended. Not everybody shared our views about violence, but we sure did. And David died before, actually they died before they finally just dropped the SLAPP-suit against us. And I wish that he had a chance to at least have that much little victory out of it. But I wanted to say about the park's future, if I have just a couple more minutes, that this thing about housing is a shell game. And that when I think about the start of People's Park, the origin story starts way back in the 1860s when they established the campus. This is the flagship campus. And in the 1860s, you were not allowed to have any housing on the campus of any kind. It was forbidden by law. So what did that do? That created an imbalance of housing for the faculty, for the students, and for the participants who were staff members and people who worked on campus. Already what they had to do was set up an exotic array of boarding houses and start to cannibalize the town around what was the campus. I think that's important because as I read more and more about the housing tracts, like a lot of people gave land, like Smith Burnwell, that was a gift to the University of California. They didn't have to spend a dime on it. And there's plenty of room in that 10-acre plot for all the housing they would ever need to house the 8,000 students that are more or less displaced because they over-enrolled by 8,000 to 10,000 beyond their long-range development plan. But they don't want to do that. They want to monetize People's Park because they're terrified of that culture. They don't want that reputation. That's what I think is really going on up there. But I would disagree that the use committee had anything to do with the volleyball court's removal. I think it was the sustained cost of the sustained protests, because we never stopped embarrassing them over having killed for volleyball. I mean, it was as absurd as it's being described, because they even took out a basketball court half a block away before they put one into People's Park. We went up there the day they were putting in that basketball court and put little baskets on the rims. So anyhow, I wanted to say one other thing about the future of the park. We need to make it very clear that the housing argument is a shell game, and it's very easy to do. And I brought my visual aid, which is a map of Southside that just shows, I hope you can see this, everybody. Here's this little green space right there. That's People's Park, 2.8 acres, more or less. And then over here we go, 10 acres at Smith Burnwell, right there, equidistance from the campus. And then right across the street, 130 acres at Clark Kerr. Yeah. Now, both of these properties are owned by the University of California, or shenanigans there, but both of them are designated for student housing, have currently housing, but have a whole lot of empty land. Now, there are more, quote, opportunity sites for housing around the campus area. They admitted that when they first started talking about building housing. But they decided People's Park was their go-to place. And I just think that's worth thinking about. And the only other thing I want to talk about is that People's Park was recently swallowed by the Business Improvement District that was born in this area. A completely undemocratic group of businesses that have to be participants in what's called the BID because it's geographical, it's not voluntary. And we need to defund the BID and make it a voluntary organization, at which point all of those businesses are not going to want a repeat of what happened in 1991 and in 69. What they would love is just to have a happy business. They do not want, and nor do I want, to have to shovel people out of jail every week and spend an enormous amount of what is public money on punishing people for believing in values that Berkeley cherishes. So that's probably 10.
That's a little
All right.